Okay, so the game I'm going to be talking about today is Dungeon Hunter 2. The Kingdom of Gothicus is in danger! Take the role of an exiled prince and save your homeland from the machinations of a shadowy plot. Some of the pros of it: it's fast-paced combat, original graphic design, and a decent story. Some cons of it: repetitive combat, lack of strategy, poor character models. One big what the fuck. For a kingdom named Gothicus? It sure doesn't look gothic. Okay, so the first Dungeon Hunter was supposedly Gameloft's take on the Diablo style of gameplay. Mash a button to destroy lots of enemies in a variety of ways. What it lacked was actual strategic combat, which was made worse with the narrow corridor-like levels. It had a decent story, but nothing that kept me hooked long enough to play through a second time. Dungeon Hunter 2 was said to promise more than its predecessor and fix some of the problems with the original. What resulted was more of the same in many respects. Now, before I get ahead of myself, let me start this review with an overview of the story of Dungeon Hunter 2. The story is quite a bit better in number 2 than it is in 1, due to the fact that there are more characters that undergo actual development. Sure, the growth is minimal at worst, but the fact that the characters do change makes for a more interesting story. This works in the game's favor when it throws in a twist for the third act that puts the past two acts in a completely different light. One can say that just because the story tries to work in some form of complexity does not excuse the fact that it still exemplifies many traditional character type tropes that we've come to groan at. But considering how bad stories can be in video games, it is refreshing to see at least some effort put into the storytelling. Be prepared to mash that attack button until your thumbs get blistered. So thus we come to the graphics. Do the graphics bring to life this world the story takes place in? Well, they most certainly do. Every enemy, every weapon, every armor piece has a unique look to them, and none of them feel out of place. Except for the fact that the game takes place in a kingdom called Gothicus. And I stereotypically associate Gothic with black, white, gray, and the occasional red, and maybe some other muted colors. As far as I can tell, the color scheme does not fit in with the above stereotype. Enemies are bright, expressive, and colorful for the most part. The multitude of levels have unique color schemes and themes, and spell effects and armor pieces are often exaggerated beyond what is necessary. If you've seen the Jester our armor set, you know what I'm talking about. It does give the world a unique flavor all its own. It just doesn't gel with the concept of the setting. I mean, come on. It's in a kingdom called Gothicus. Make the kingdom look gothic. Oh well. Also, this game still suffers from being very corridor-ish. There may be one or two areas that are more open, and some of the levels are really massive compared to some of the earlier levels. But there's usually a level in Dungeon Hunter 2 has maybe one or two linear paths between point A and point B. For a game that's supposedly bigger and better than its predecessor, it's kind of disappointing. And I really wish that Gameloft had taken the time to open up the levels even more than they've already been opened up, which, in all honesty, isn't that much. It would have gone a long way towards adding a greater sense of world building that the graphics do so much work towards. You know? And like a lot of Gameloft games, there are two different versions, one for iPad, one for iPhone, and there really isn't much difference between the two. And, well, corridors, plus button mashing, plus lack of strategy, it equals sleep-inducing boredom. While the story was decent enough to keep me hooked, and the variety in the graphics was pretty to look at, there were times when I was just bored out of my skull because I was just button mashing from point A to point B with occasional breaks to check my loot to see if I got some better gear. It did not make for fun times. This is because the enemies have almost no other strategy except to swarm you from all sides. You almost never need to use any of your active skills, except for boss fights, and that's only because bosses have a lot of health. Targeting is also a problem. The game auto-targets the closest enemy, which is frustrating because, let's say you're wailing away on one target, you almost have it killed when another enemy comes up from behind, and the game auto-targets the new enemy instead of allowing you to kill off the other enemy. It's frustrating because now you have two enemies to deal with. You could have had only one to deal with. So, it can be frustrating. And also the game has a really hard time breaking open barrels. Like, I kid you not. Your character will glitch out and try to run to some weird predetermined spot. It's ridiculous. Even when the barrel's right in front of your character, he'll still glitch out. you start to learn all sorts of subtle little things that you can do to minimize the glitch, but still, it's just wow. And well, okay, so then we come to the sound design. The sound design is standard. You know, all of the enemies have, you know, sound to go with them. Thing is, it doesn't really leave much of an impression, which you can tell due to the fact that I'm having such a hard time trying to describe it. Sure, you make a sound when you make, you know, a grunting sound when you get hit. The thwacking sound is there for when you hit enemies. You know, opening chests has a sound to them. Leveling up gives a particular sound cue, and all sorts of these little things like that. But it really doesn't add much to it. It doesn't bring the game above and beyond just being average. You know, and it is kind of disappointing because this is supposedly better than the first Dungeon Hunter. You know, also, multiplayer just doesn't work. I've tried to get multiplayer to work for Dungeon Hunter 2. I've never gotten it to work. And you know, even the folks at Touch Arcade, when they did their review on this game, they also had this problem. They could not figure out how multiplayer was supposed to work. And so it's disappointing because multiplayer could have added more to the game. Like, maybe you might be able to, like, develop strategies, you know, like, say one character tanks, another person sneaks up from behind, and a third person ranges from afar. There isn't that because multiplayer just doesn't work. And it's disappointing. It's very disappointing. So, in conclusion, Dungeon Hunter 2 is a game that, while it has some good elements to it, you know, the story's decent, and it actually has a third act twist that really makes the game memorable on that level. The gameplay is just boring and repetitive, and it's also glitchy on a certain level, and also multiplayer doesn't work. So this game promises a lot, and it's supposedly Gameloft's take on it's basically Gameloft's Diablo clone for the iDevices. It just doesn't live up to that. My rating, it's 5 out of 10. It's average. You know, it's got some good elements, but it's not enough to really bring it above the pack. And my recommendation is to avoid it. It's pretty expensive. I think it's like $7 for the iPhone version and $7 for the iPad version. I purchased both of these versions. I did play the iPhone version more, about 40 plus hours, and I completed the game about 2 or 3 times. It is nice that when you beat the game, it starts you over, but at the next highest difficulty setting. It is nice that it does try and cycle that, but it still doesn't excuse the fact that the core gameplay is just boring, and it just doesn't do enough to make it stand out. You know, I did play 6 hours on my new iPad 2. Okay, so that's my review.